They didn't say goodbye. They were taken. At just 7 years old, Spartan children were torn from the warmth of their homes, pulled from the arms of their mothers, and delivered into the hands of the state. There were no tears allowed, no long embraces, no final lullabies whispered in the night. From that moment on, the boy ceased to belong to his family. He belonged to Sparta. In this ancient city, childhood was not seen as a time for play or innocence. It was a testing ground, a forge in which every trace of softness would be burned away until only discipline remained. While the rest of Greece taught music, poetry, and philosophy, Sparta taught endurance, obedience, and pain. The Athenians built mines. The Spartans built soldiers. The transition began the moment the boy crossed the threshold into the agoge, Sparta's state-run training system that turned children into warriors through a process of relentless hardship. It was less an education than a transformation, a dismantling of comfort, a stripping of weakness, and a remaking of body and spirit. The first night set the tone. The boys were led into long stone halls, lit by torches that sputtered against the wind, and they were told to sleep on bare reeds they had to gather themselves from the riverbanks. No blankets, no pillows, not even a fire to chase away the chill. If a boy gathered too many reeds, he was scolded for seeking comfort, too few, and he froze. From the very start, they were taught that survival depended on judgment, not luck. Their instructors, known as paidonomoi, were not caretakers but sculptors of endurance. They barked commands instead of encouragement and replaced tenderness with trials. They believed that true discipline could not be spoken into existence. It had to be beaten, starved, and frozen into the soul. Each dawn began with the sound of a horn echoing through the valley. The boys rose instantly, their muscles stiff, their stomachs empty, and their minds already alert. They washed in icy water, rubbed themselves with coarse sand to toughen their skin, and then assembled for inspection. Any sign of hesitation, a shiver, a sigh, a lingering glance toward the horizon, invited punishment. Breakfast was a thin portion of black broth, a mix of pork, vinegar, and blood so bitter that it was said to harden the will faster than any speech. Hunger was constant and deliberate. They were told to steal food if they needed more, but if caught, the lash awaited them not for theft, but for failure. To a Spartan, cleverness was as essential as strength. The agoge's first and greatest lesson was control. Control of hunger, of fatigue, of fear, and of pain. To show emotion was to admit defeat, so when they fell or bled, they were ordered to remain silent. Tears brought ridicule. Complaints brought the whip. Over time, they learned to smile through pain, to bite their tongues until blood filled their mouths, rather than utter a single cry. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the boys' bodies began to change. Muscle replaced softness, calluses thickened their hands, and their eyes grew calm and focused. They were taught to move like predators, quick and quiet, to fight with bare hands, and to endure the sting of cold winds against naked skin. Their world shrank to three ideas: obedience, discipline, and survival. When one boy failed, the group was punished. They ate together, slept together, trained together, and were beaten together. Brotherhood wasn't friendship. It was necessity. The only way to endure the cruelty of the agoge was to stop thinking of oneself as an individual. You were not I, you were we. At night they fought mock battles under the moonlight, their silhouettes darting across the dust. The older boys often ambushed the younger ones, testing their alertness. Bruises were proof of vigilance, and scars became badges of pride. Every wound told a story not of weakness, but of endurance. There were no gentle words, no laughter, no warmth. Even affection was turned into a lesson. The instructors occasionally allowed small competitions of courage. Boys were ordered to stand motionless while others struck them. The one who endured longest without flinching earned a portion of respect, but not comfort. Respect in Sparta was colder than the mountains that surrounded it. Every year the training intensified. They learned to fight in pairs, to ambush, to track, and to survive in the wilderness with nothing but a dagger. During winter, they were sent into the woods for days at a time. forbidden to light fires, forced to hunt or steal whatever food they could find. Many returned limping, some didn't return at all, and those who failed to survive were forgotten without ceremony. The agoge didn't mourn the dead, it honored the living who endured. At an age when most children in the world were playing, these boys were learning to kill and to keep secrets. They learned to speak little and think fast, to mask emotion behind stillness. Sparta valued silence so deeply that even conversation became an exercise in restraint. Brevity was an art. The fewer the words, the stronger the man. That's why the term laconic, meaning concise speech, was born from their way of speaking. By the age of 10, a Spartan child could take a beating without a sound, march barefoot across miles of rocky ground, and sleep through a freezing night as calmly as if he were wrapped in wool. He had learned that comfort was a lie, and that pleasure weakened resolve. But beneath the harshness of the system lay a strange form of purpose. Every punishment, every cold dawn, every moment of fear had one goal: to teach them that strength came from mastering themselves. A Spartan who could control his hunger could command his body. A Spartan who could control his fear could command others. That was the foundation upon which all of Sparta stood. The boys didn't dream of freedom. They dreamed of discipline. They didn't wish for warmth. They wished for endurance. And when the night grew too cold, when their fingers stiffened and their bodies ached, they would whisper to themselves the same truth passed down from generations before. Pain teaches. Pain cleanses. Pain makes us worthy. By the time the boy who once trembled at separation turned 12, he no longer remembered his mother's face. He no longer feared pain or cold or death. He had been stripped of everything except the one thing Sparta valued most: the will to obey. The agoge had done its work. The child was gone. The soldier had begun. As the boys grew older, their training in the agoge transformed from endurance to domination, not only over their bodies, but over their instincts, their emotions, and even their sense of compassion. The years between 12 and 16 were a descent into controlled brutality, where every trace of innocence was systematically erased and replaced with discipline so absolute it bordered on madness. At this stage, the boys were divided into groups, each led by an older youth who had already survived the first wave of training. These older leaders, barely 17 themselves, were both mentors and tormentors. They ruled their small squads with iron authority, testing them constantly with hunger, exhaustion, and fear. They learned that in Sparta, authority wasn't given, it was taken, proven, and defended every single day. Meals became even smaller, and punishments harsher. They ate together in what were called syssitia, communal mess halls, where food was served in silence. Conversation was rare, and only allowed if it was useful or necessary. Laughter was seen as arrogance. Complaints were treated as weakness. The portions were intentionally insufficient, just enough to keep them alive, but never satisfied. Hunger became their constant companion, a reminder that survival required effort, not entitlement. When they went out to hunt, they were forbidden from using traps or torches. They had to stalk their prey barefoot through the darkness, guided only by instinct and moonlight. The point was not to catch an animal. It was to control fear, to learn patience, and to understand that nature rewarded those who could endure stillness. Those who were caught stealing food were not punished for theft itself, but for being careless enough to be caught. The logic was cruel but clear. A true warrior must be cunning. Survival demanded intelligence, not just strength. Even morality in Sparta was reshaped into utility. Right and wrong were measured by effectiveness, not ethics. Their nights were colder, their mornings harsher, and their tasks endless. They were made to wrestle each other for hours, to run until their feet split open, to carry logs heavier than their own bodies across fields of rock. Yet the greatest test was not physical, it was emotional. Every moment of their day was designed to strip away attachment. They could not depend on pity or affection, because in battle, those feelings could cost lives. The instructors used humiliation as a tool, calling out boys publicly for any sign of weakness. They were forced to stand naked in the center of the camp, while others mocked them, learning that pride was meaningless without strength. Sometimes even the strongest were punished without reason, to teach that control had to exist even under injustice. To be a Spartan was to accept pain without question and authority without doubt. There were no words of comfort. No one said, "You did well." The only praise worth earning was survival. And when one boy proved himself superior faster, stronger, or calmer under pressure, the others envied him, but also respected him. They knew that hierarchy was sacred. Those who stood above had earned their place through blood, discipline, and silence. The most respected virtue of all was self-resigned self-restraint. It was said that the man who could master himself could master the world. So when the boys fought, they were told not to fight for victory, but for control. Losing your temper was considered a greater failure than losing the match. The older they became, the more they were tested in ways that blurred the line between lesson and torment. They were sometimes forced to endure cold nights without moving a muscle, their bodies shaking uncontrollably under thin cloaks, while instructors walked among them, whispering insults meant to provoke reaction. The one who remained motionless, who controlled his breath and gaze, was marked for greatness. By the age of 15, most boys had learned to keep a blank expression even under pain. Their eyes were empty but focused, their movements precise and economical. The agoge had removed excess not just from their bodies, but from their very souls. The system extended beyond training fields and into temples. The most famous and terrifying ritual took place at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. It was here that boys faced one of the ultimate tests of endurance, the flagellation ceremony. Before the statue of the goddess, surrounded by their peers, they were whipped publicly, not once or twice, but continuously, sometimes to the brink of death. The goal wasn't punishment, it was purification. The boy who endured longest without crying out was celebrated as a symbol of Spartan virtue. Those who screamed or fainted were marked with shame. The people of Sparta gathered to watch these ceremonies, not as spectators of cruelty, but as witnesses of pride. Mothers watched their sons bleed and did not flinch. To them, suffering was proof that the system worked, that their sons were becoming warriors worthy of the city. And the boys understood. They didn't see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as tools being sharpened for war. When they bled, they smiled. When they fell, they rose again. The whip was not an enemy, it was a teacher. Discipline was not merely obedience, it was the foundation of their entire identity. To disobey meant to deny Sparta itself, and Sparta was everything. In those years of training, they developed a strange relationship with pain. It ceased to be something to escape and became something to understand. They learned its rhythm, its limits, its silence. Pain, hunger, and exhaustion became the language of transformation. Those who faltered didn't always survive. Some were expelled from the agoge, a fate worse than death. To be cast out of the program was to lose honor, family, and purpose. Such boys became outcasts, living on the edges of society, ignored by those who had once called them brothers. The city had no use for men who could not endure. For the ones who stayed, the transformation was almost supernatural. Their bodies hardened, their minds sharpened, and their sense of fear dissolved into instinct. They began to move with a quiet confidence that came from knowing they had survived things most people couldn't even imagine. They were no longer learning to fight. They were learning to become unbreakable. They also began to form a deeper bond with one another. Through shared suffering came absolute trust. They didn't need words to communicate. A glance, a nod, a brief movement of the hand, that was enough. This silent understanding would later make them invincible on the battlefield, where communication through words was impossible and hesitation meant death. By the time they reached 16, the boys had faced hunger, cold, humiliation, and physical torment without collapsing. Their strength was no longer just muscle, it was conviction, the certainty that they could survive anything. The instructors often reminded them of the city's motto, "Sparta needs no walls. Her sons are her defense." It was a reminder that every one of them carried the weight of their civilization on their shoulders. There were no fortresses around Sparta because the men themselves were the fortress. Their bodies were the walls. Their discipline was the foundation. And though they didn't realize it yet, Everything they had endured, every cut, every bruise, every moment of silence under pain, was preparing them for a single truth that would define their adult lives. That the enemy they must conquer first was not the Persian, not the Athenian, not the barbarian beyond the mountains, but the weakness inside themselves. By the time a Spartan boy reached his 17th year, he was no longer seen as a child. His voice had deepened, his muscles had hardened, and his eyes had learned to show no emotion. He had survived 10 years of the agoge, 10 years of cold nights, hunger, punishment, and silence. Yet the hardest test still awaited him, one that would separate those who merely endured from those who were worthy to call themselves warriors. The final stage of the agoge was known as the crypteia, a secret rite of passage wrapped in darkness and fear. The very name came from kryptos, meaning hidden, and for good reason. The details of the ritual were whispered, never written down, and even centuries later, historians struggle to understand its full nature. But what is known paints a picture of terrifying clarity. The most promising young men were selected, usually in their late teens, and sent out into the wilderness with nothing but a dagger, a cloak, and the command to survive alone for weeks or even months. They were forbidden from lighting fires, from speaking to anyone, or from returning until ordered. The purpose of the crypteia was to teach them how to live as shadows, unseen and unheard, ready to kill without hesitation and endure without complaint. But survival was not their only task. They were told to move through the land at night, watching the enslaved helot population, the laborers who farmed Spartan soil. If a helot was seen as rebellious or too strong, he became the target. The young men were expected to strike silently and disappear again into the dark. It was a grim ritual, a blend of training and terror that turned boys into instruments of fear. To the outside world, it was barbaric. To the Spartans, it was necessary. The crypteia was the final stripping away of compassion. Those who returned alive were no longer considered students of the agoge. They had become its product, cold, efficient, and utterly obedient. When they came back to the city, their faces were unreadable. Their mothers didn't weep or cheer. They simply looked into their sons' eyes and saw what Sparta had created, a being who no longer feared pain, loss, or death. That was the point of it all, to make death meaningless. Once accepted as full citizens, they joined the syssitia, the mess halls of men, where they would live, eat, and train for the rest of their lives. Even in adulthood, Spartan warriors rarely returned home. The concept of private life barely existed. Their loyalty belonged to the unit, to the phalanx, to the collective body that moved as one on the battlefield. Inside those communal halls, they shared everything: food, stories, victories, and silence. The same lessons drilled into them as children continued into manhood: eat little, speak less, and never show weakness. Comfort remained the enemy. Even as full-grown warriors, they slept on hard surfaces, bathed in cold water, and endured every hardship without complaint. When war came, they were ready not because they enjoyed violence, but because it was familiar. Battle was simply an extension of the agoge, another test of control and composure. While other soldiers trembled before the enemy, the Spartans stood motionless, their shields locked, their breathing slow and measured. They had faced hunger, cold, and death since childhood. Now they faced it again, only with weapons in their hands. It's said that during one campaign, a foreign general asked a Spartan soldier, "What kind of men are you that you do not fear pain?" The Spartan simply replied, "We trained for it." That simple answer captured everything the agoge stood for. The program had not been about creating perfect fighters, it had been about creating perfect endurance. The pain of those years didn't just harden the body, it reshaped the soul. The boys who once wept for home learned to see suffering as beauty, obedience as freedom, and silence as strength. They no longer sought victory over others, but mastery over themselves. And in that mastery lay their true power. Every Spartan carried within him the lessons of the agoge for life. When they marched into war, they carried no fear. When they faced impossible odds, they smiled. When they felt hunger, They remembered the years when they ate less than a handful of food a day. When the cold bit into their flesh, they remembered the nights when frost had covered their cloaks and they had not moved. The agoge had taught them that the body is weak, but the will can be infinite. It was this belief that turned them into the most feared warriors of the ancient world. At Thermopylae, when 300 Spartans stood against thousands, it wasn't their weapons that made them legendary, it was their discipline. The enemy expected panic, but the Spartans moved like a single creature, breathing and striking in rhythm, unmoved by the chaos around them. They didn't fight for glory, or for wealth, or even for victory. They fought to prove that nothing, not even death, could break them. And when the final moments came, when arrows blotted out the sun and death fell like rain, they did not run. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their minds calm, their hearts steady, and their eyes fixed forward. This is what the agoge had created: men who were not merely unafraid to die, but who had already accepted death as part of life. Even centuries later, the echo of that discipline survives. We remember the Spartans not because they were invincible, but because they chose to endure the impossible. Their story isn't about war, it's about willpower. It's about the moment a 7-year-old child, trembling and barefoot, stepped out of his home and walked into a life of pain without ever looking back. He didn't know it then, but that single step marked the beginning of something greater than himself. It was the step that built an empire of courage, one that still inspires the world thousands of years later. The Spartan ideal wasn't perfection. It was resistance. It was the belief that if you could conquer yourself, no enemy could ever truly defeat you. In the end, the agoge was more than a school. It was a crucible, a place where boys were burned until only steel remained. The boys who survived became men of legend, their names carried through time as symbols of strength and self-mastery. They didn't build monuments or write philosophy. They didn't seek riches or pleasure. They sought one thing only: the power to never bend. And perhaps that's why, even now, the name Spartan still carries weight. It reminds us that comfort is fleeting, but discipline is eternal. That true strength isn't found in luxury or ease, but in the quiet defiance of a soul that refuses to give up. So when the world feels unbearable, when the nights are long and cold, remember the boys of Sparta, barefoot, hungry, and unbroken. They didn't wait for warmth to return. They became their own fire.